So good morning. I'm Arthur Mary. I'm a psychologist, psychoanalyst. I work in France. I'm going to make a kind of boring presentation, I think. Somehow, I think we'll hear some links between our two presentations. English is not my native language, so excuse me. I'm going to read a lot. We gather around the theme of evidence-based practices, and I am personally quite critical and puzzled by what I consider to be an ideology. I realize that this term is not well liked, as it immediately carries a polemical charge. If it's any reassurance, I believe that my intervention, my reflections, and my practices as a clinical psychologist with patients are tinged with my own ideological stance. In short, there is no epistemic neutrality when addressing human facts. Believing oneself to be neutral often means being inhabited by implicit ideological preconceptions. Believe that evidence-based sciences are the alpha and omega of science is, in my opinion, naive. This is a summary of what I'm going to discuss. For my work, I adopted a definition of ideology inspired by the philosopher Louis Althusser. By ideology, we understand a system of representations produced by historical and social development and playing a role in a given society at a given moment in its history. We could say that an ideology is always a symptom of a society. As such, the idea of evidence-based knowledge falls within an ideology, which is obvious and not particularly problematic in itself, I think. What seems questionable is that this idea of evidence should guarantee a certain number of knowledges. And it seems to me that it costs researchers precious access to certain more delicate knowledge, and that it could well orient practices, particularly social practices, in debatable directions. When Thomas Kuhn described scientific paradigms, he did so in terms that could recall Althusser's work on ideology. But how do we pronounce paradigm? Paradigm. A scientific paradigm must always be considered in relation to the society and historical moment in which it appears, according to Thomas Kuhn. The paradigm includes a set of theories accepted by the scientific community, methods and techniques of scientific investigation, the questions the community will consider relevant, and by contrast, the questions the community will dismiss or even be incapable of contemplating. And finally, the standards of validation and the criteria for assessing the relevance of a scientific conclusion. I will state an obvious fact, at least it has been obvious for a couple of centuries now. To be scientific, an observation or experiment must be reproducible, at least in theory. If it is not reproducible, one is justified in seriously doubting its validity. But when I experience meeting a human, a cult member, or guru, or former member, is this unique, original, unprecedented encounter reproducible? A philological study on the anthropological roots of the idea of evidence should be undertaken. It seems to me that the human obsession with the question of evidence is rooted in the mystery of our origin. Consider paternity tests and lineage verifications. How many Greek heroes grappled with these questions in their myth? Hercules, unsure if he was the son of Amphitryon or Zeus. Oedipus, ignorant of his parents' identity. Theseus, with mother, spent the night with both Aegeus and Poseidon, and so on. They are all in a quest for an evidence. Manifestly, the question of proof regarding our origin in existence is so profound that it has needed to be repeated across the vast array of our myth. There would certainly be interesting things to say from the Christian myth of the proofs demanded by St. Thomas, who only believes what he says. The theme of this year's ICSA Congress highlights the paradigm and thus the historical moment where the idea of evidence takes such a place. I would like to bring a few, let's say, sobering elements regarding this paradigm of evidence-based practices and knowledge. For several years now, it has no longer been possible to ignore the problem in scientific publications in medicine and social sciences that use statistics. John Ioannidis developed a mathematical model in 2005, suggesting that most scientific studies using probabilistic models were probably wrong. That is, these studies produce a large number of false positives. He pointed to modest sample sizes, a lack of rigor in the methodologies employed, and the pressure to publish. Have we truly emerged from this in 20 years? In conclusion, Ioannidis' model asserts that approximately 96% of publications in biomedical research and social sciences were likely to be false due to the misuse of statistics. Valentin Amrain and his colleagues showed a great naivety in believing that merely meeting the threshold of statistical significance was sufficient to establish scientific facts. Beyond the mediocrity of such procedure, the authors showed that it led to a misuse of the mathematical tool. Researchers resorting to hacking strategies to manipulate data and analysis methods to finally obtain a p-value below 5%. In another field, in oncology, which I imagine to be a more serious field than Celtic studies, Begley and colleagues arrived at an alarming conclusion that only 11% of experimental cancer research was reproducible. There is no need to be a conspiracy theorist or member of an anti-medicine cult to make such a disillusioned statements. One only needs to do mathematics. This must surely have fueled society's distrust of medicine and science in general. Undoubtedly, researchers have a moral obligation to society to demonstrate scientific integrity. Continuing, 4 years ago, 2020, a research team led by Elliott estimated that 70% of observations relying on functional MRI were not reproducible. I won't elaborate here on the reasons therein covered to explain this catastrophe. As a psychologist, the question of why my colleagues continue to use the DSM is particularly present in my mind. A few reminders about this probabilistic psychiatry manual. First, it is a statistical approach, assuming an average statistical patient who does not exist and whom we never meet, an average cult follower who does not exist. Secondly, by the standards of evidence-based psychiatry, what is in this manual is scientifically erroneous. The DSM authors themselves affirm this. According to Alan Francis, the DSM-5 is a reckless misadventure filled with unsafe and scientifically unsound changes. Those are quotes. It has introduced changes that seem to be driven more by preconception and profit than by scientific evidence. It has created diagnostic inflation that will turn millions of people into patients and so on. Alan Francis is Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry, and he chaired the task force that produced the DSM-4. It is noted that Stephen Hyman, former director of the National Institute for Mental Health, estimated that using the DSM had wasted much research time, stating that it was an obstacle to research, and strongly encouraged researchers in psychology, psychopathology, and psychiatry not to use this book in their research, lest their work seriously lack validity. I won't go into the numerous denunciations of conflicts of interest with the pharmaceutical industry regularly reiterated by French medical journals, including the journal Prescrire, which is in psychopharmacology. In short, considering cult-related questions in terms of the DSM means disregarding recommendations and acting as if this manual were scientifically valid. I mentioned this for research practices, but one must also consider the cost of meeting someone, for example, a patient, by thinking of him or her in the abstract and false categories of a probabilistic psychiatry manual, acting as if we were facing a post-traumatic stress disorder, when it is actually a person with a history, thoughts, and feelings far exceeding the criteria of a disorder whose scientific validity is far from consensual. But a human being is not a disorder. Rather, I believe a human is a complex arrangement of drives, embodied drives, a structured order, more or less stable over time, from which their unique normativity is derived. Acting as if we were facing the perverse and manipulative guru that the theory promised us is again to shield ourselves from a possibly more complex encounter than the rather sanitized theoretical abstraction. Whenever we act as if, are we not doing something that cultural anthropologists would simply call rituals? We act as if the grand author of scientific authority had blessed our research practice. One should seriously consider the risk that certain paradigms of thought push us to adopt an as-if behavior described by Ellen Dutch. I'm quite pessimistic about the ability of institutions like university, or at least universities in France, only universities I know, to avoid encouraging conformity in thoughts, practices, methods, and so on. Conforming to consensual scientific methods is probably reassuring and protects us from the unpleasant feeling of being wrong. I fear that the way researchers learn their trade involves a form of imitation, an introjection of somewhat idealized procedures. They are highly adaptable, but their adaptation is rooted in imitation. These words are those of Ellen Dutch regarding the as-if personality. As with any profession, researchers also develop a professional habitus, in the sense of Pierre Bourdieu. This habitus shapes how they work, interact with others, and understand their environment in a manner consistent with the norms of the profession and the expectations placed on researchers' role in society. There is a whole sociology of the research work that should not be neglected. I want to focus on a brief example. I have attended numerous doctoral thesis defenses in clinical psychopathology and sociology. In recent years in France, it has become increasingly difficult to assert the methodological and epistemic value of single case studies, for instance. Universities are increasingly imposing the use of statistical methods, even for research that falls within paradigms centered on the uniqueness of the case or on the projective test or very small significant sample, with no intention to overgeneralize the observations. Even though this is inconsistent, research directors and doctoral students find themselves having to implement statistical protocols perfectly knowing that these are inconsistent with the research paradigms. Often, both professors and young researchers are fully aware that the statistical setup will not have the necessary rigor to draw any meaningful conclusions. In short, everyone is just going through the motions and behaving as if. I've been amused or perhaps irritated to witness a sort of ritual that repeated itself at almost every thesis defense I attended. The doctoral candidate would take on a regretful tone and conclude that, unfortunately, the statistic had not validated the tested hypothesis and that different methods should have been employed for the numbers to yield any significant insights. A bigger sample would have been necessary, but unfortunately, it was not possible and not interesting. Once this act of contrition was performed, the candidate could move on to the serious work in present research of great depth and scientific quality. So there's a kind of summary of what I present. Controversies. Having been said this, the question is it all bullshit? Oh. Is it all just rhetoric? I asked old friend Aristotle, what is rhetoric? According to him, rhetoric is the art of arousing affects, emotions in others. That's why his book, Rhetoric, is a true treatise on psychology, on the psychology of human affective life. Convincing someone, whether it's a cult member knocking on my door, that advertiser wanting to sell your product, or researcher arguing the relevance of his conclusions, always involves arousing affective dispositions in the other that are conducive to acceptance. In a previous work, I proposed considering moments when one tries to convince someone in terms of the performativity of speech acts. I relied on the philosopher Austin. I was less interested in the validity of arguments than in their performative effectiveness. I considered situations such as a follower wants to convince me of a doctrine. An anti-cult activist wants to convince a follower that he is under. A journalist wants to convince his audience of the danger of cults by using scary music in his documentary, and so on. So, is a scientific publication an argumentative text aimed at producing in me affects, dispositions, beliefs, or even behaviors and decisions? McCabe and Castell showed that scientific publications that include images of brains through MRI are more convincing and appear reliable to their readers, including researchers. In other words, from the point of view of their performative effectiveness, these speech acts are happy. A few years later, in 2014, Weisberg and colleagues discussed the seductive effects of explanations by neuroscience, especially if brain images appeared in color, even what researchers and readers. If you allow me this shortcut, I assert that evidence is not only necessary, it is also seductive. That evidence is always a rhetorical process that arouses affective, emotional dispositions in us. It produces intellectual pleasure. It satisfies our epistemological drives, to put it in Freudian terms. This is not a problem to be rid of. However, it seems reasonable to be clear about our often unnoticed influences that determine how we conduct our research and how we help all those who seek our assistance, followers or ex-followers. I would like to propose a kind of meta-psychology of evidence-based practices with the help of Bion. I don't know, how do you pronounce his name in English? Bion? Bion? Bion. He was British. Bion, Wilfred Bion, delved into the profound psychological issues involved in our experience of proof. He highlighted the emotional depth of this experience and questioned each individual's capacity to tolerate uncertainty. Perhaps those in exact sciences and proponents of a hardening and mathematization of our social sciences struggle with experiencing uncertainty. According to the British psychoanalyst, known for his passion for mathematics, the driving force behind our quest for proof may well be linked to deep-seated anxiety or fear. He extends his hypothesis to psychotherapy and the experience of psychoanalysis. Often, the analysand and the analyst are compelled to search together for something that serves as proof of the emotional experience they are navigating. Bion, in 1970, argued that psychoanalysis, a field where scientific rigor is seriously adopted, should formulate testable hypotheses during analysis. Yet no psychoanalysis is replicable. This can be said of any human encounter. George Delvaux arrived at a similar conclusions through his work as an anthropologist and ethnopsychoanalyst. He emphasized that our methodological choices in behavioral sciences stem from the research and wish. In light of his work, one might question whether the overvaluation of evidence-based sciences as highly protocolized devices for knowledge production signifies an anxiety treated through collective obsessive procedures. According to this psychoanalytic hypothesis, evidence-based approaches reveal much about our collective anxieties and need for control. Interestingly enough, the philosopher and logician Ludwig Wittgenstein reached quite similar conclusions, albeit through a different, very different path. Is my reading okay? Okay, I'm near my conclusion. That being said, it seems to me that in our practices, when faced with a cultic situation, whether as a psychologist, psychotherapist, lawyer, social worker, counselor, psychoanalyst, general practitioner, psychiatrist, community activist, nurse, religious representative, teacher, expert witness, and so on, our need for reassurance may be satisfied by the conviction that our practices are based on solid evidence, on theoretical representations that have proven themselves. However, our professions involve encounters, singular encounters. The person who will walk through my office door next Monday, I have read no book that mentions him or her. None of the many evidence-based studies I have carefully studied mention this particular case, his uniqueness. What is the risk? The risk is that I may confine this person within my conceptions based on evidence constructed on statistical correlations extrapolated from others who compose the sample. The risk is that I might miss the human encounter by interposing between the other and myself a reassuring erudition of heterogeneous knowledge. Evidence-based research is a serious paradigm, but it is just one paradigm among others. Often, it can be criticized for functioning as an argument from authority that interrupts dialogue. It may lead to disqualifying good alternatives among knowledge-building procedures, but it is an entire intellectual, editorial, academic environment that self-reinforces consensus and thus deprives itself of other ways of conducting research intelligently. These alternatives exist, and unfortunately, they often receive no attention from proponents of evidence-based procedures. I imagined a kind of dialogue between those two guys. I hesitated a lot on how to call the second one, the singular experience-based guy. The first one would say, what I assert is based on evidence, so you're wrong. But what I assert is based on a subjective, unique, non-repeatable experience, the recording of which is unfortunately always incomplete. What I assert is based on evidence independent of my subjectivity, although it must be acknowledged that my subjectivity has structured my body of evidence in this direction. In what I claim to have observed, I am obliged to specify the role I myself played in the described situation. In the same dialogue I'm held when questioning practices. What I do, my way of working, is based on a body of studies more or less serious, but which converge in a direction that guides my practice. What I do, my way of working, is based on a singular ethical disposition, that is, on the questioning of my spontaneity by the presence of others. This quote by Levinas is his definition of ethics, the questioning of my spontaneity and also my body's spontaneity by the presence of others. With these few words, I hope to have added a small drop of critical distance to the glass of evidence-based sciences. Thank you.